car door slammed with the violence of thunder, metal against metal echoing through the pristine suburban morning like a declaration of war. Agent David Carter stood frozen on his own driveway, briefcase in hand, watching as Linda Hartwell marched away from his vehicle with the righteous fury of someone who believed herself absolutely untouchable. The driver's side door of his unmarked federal sedan hung at an unnatural angle, its windows spiderwebbed with fractures that caught the morning sunlight like broken promises. What had been a routine Tuesday morning, coffee, case files, another day protecting national security, had just become something else entirely. "Next time you'll think twice about parking where you don't belong," Linda shouted over her shoulder, her voice carrying the imperious tone of someone who had never faced real consequences for her actions. Her perfectly coiffed silver hair didn't move in the breeze, held in place by enough hairspray to pose an environmental hazard, and her designer tracksuit screamed money and entitlement in equal measure. David's hands trembled slightly as he assessed the damage. The door handle was completely destroyed, the frame bent beyond repair, and the electronic systems that connected his vehicle to federal databases were likely compromised. In his 15 years as a federal agent with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force, he had faced armed drug dealers, corrupt politicians, and international criminals who would kill him without hesitation. But none of them had ever damaged federal property while he watched helplessly from his own driveway. "Linda," David called out, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone trained to de-escalate dangerous situations. "You just damaged federal property. We need to discuss this." She whirled around with the theatrical flourish of a community theater actress, her face flushed, with the kind of anger that came from having her authority questioned. "Federal property? It's an ugly grey car parked illegally in front of my house. I don't care if you think you're some kind of government worker. This is Willowbrook Heights, and we have standards." The irony was staggering. David's ugly grey car was a specially equipped federal surveillance vehicle, registered to the United States government and currently loaded with encrypted communication equipment worth more than Linda's annual HOA president's salary. But to her, it was just another eyesore that violated her vision of suburban perfection. "Ma'am, that vehicle is registered to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You've just committed a federal crime." Linda's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the sound of someone who had spent 3 years as HOA president, believing that her authority extended far beyond the bounds of rational governance. "FBI, please, you're probably some insurance salesman trying to intimidate me with government nonsense. I know exactly what kind of people move into rental properties in this neighborhood." The words hit David like physical blows, each assumption layered with implications that went far beyond property disputes. Rental property. His house, which he owned outright. Insurance salesman, his career protecting national security. Government nonsense. The authority that had sent him undercover in some of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the country. But what truly stunned David was the casual certainty with which Linda dismissed not just his identity, but his right to exist peacefully in the community where he had chosen to live. For 18 months, she had made his life a systematic nightmare of HOA violations, parking complaints, and increasingly aggressive confrontations that had escalated to this moment of actual vandalism. The campaign had started subtly. His grass was a 1/4 inch too long. His mailbox needed repainting. His work schedule, which required him to leave at odd hours for surveillance operations, was disruptive to the neighborhood's quiet enjoyment. Each complaint had been delivered with the smug authority of someone who believed that home ownership came with the right to control other people's lives. But Linda's harassment had grown bolder over time. She had his car towed from his own driveway claiming it was abandoned. She filed noise complaints about his air conditioning unit. She organized neighborhood meetings to discuss the rental proper type problem that somehow always focused on David's house specifically. Now, standing in the wreckage of her latest escalation, David felt the familiar burn of injustice that had driven him to law enforcement in the first place. The same anger that motivated him to spend months infiltrating criminal organizations, the same determination that had earned him commendations from 3 different FBI directors. But what Linda Hartwell didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined as she strutted back toward her pristine colonial home, was that she had just assaulted a federal agent and destroyed federal property while that agent was preparing to leave for a briefing on a major organized crime investigation. And federal agents, unlike suburban residents, had resources that extended far beyond HOA complaint procedures. The path to this morning's confrontation had been paved with 18 months of escalating harassment that David had endured with the patience of someone who understood the difference between battles worth fighting and wars worth winning. Moving to Willowbrook Heights had been a strategic decision, a quiet suburban community where a federal agent could maintain his cover identity while staying close enough to the city for operational requirements. But David Carter's idea of quiet suburban living had collided spectacularly with Linda Hartwell's vision of community control. As the newly elected HOA president, Linda had campaigned on a platform of maintaining property values and community standards. Code words that every resident understood meant increased enforcement and decreased tolerance for anything that deviated from her narrow definition of acceptable suburban behavior. David's first encounter with Linda's authority had come 3 weeks after he moved in, when she appeared at his door with a clipboard and an expression of barely concealed disgust. "Mr. Carter," she had announced without preamble, "your lawn maintenance schedule is unacceptable. The grass in your front yard exceeds the community standard of 2 inches by approximately 1/4 inch." David had looked at his perfectly ordinary suburban lawn, indistinguishable from dozens of others in the neighborhood, and realized he was being introduced to a level of petty tyranny that made some criminal organizations seem reasonable by comparison. "I'll take care of it this weekend," he had replied, hoping to end the interaction quickly. "This weekend is too late. Community standards require immediate compliance. I'll need to see the lawn mowed by tomorrow evening, or you'll face your first violation notice." The violation notice had arrived exactly 24 hours later, despite David having mowed his lawn that same afternoon. The infraction: failure to properly dispose of grass clippings in accordance with community guidelines. A rule that David discovered applied exclusively to his property, as neighboring homes had visible grass clippings that apparently didn't violate Linda's standards. From there, the harassment had become systematic and relentless. His work schedule, which required him to leave for surveillance operations at various times, depending on operational needs, was deemed disruptive to the neighborhood's quiet enjoyment. Never mind that David drove an unmarked sedan and left as quietly as possible. Linda had decided that any deviation from a standard 9-to-5 routine constituted a community disturbance. His modest landscaping choices were criticized for being inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetics. The small herb garden he had planted for cooking was classified as agricultural, activity inappropriate for residential zoning. The motion sensor security lights he had installed for professional reasons were denounced as excessive illumination that disrupts neighbors' sleep patterns. Each complaint triggered HOA meetings, fines, and increasingly restrictive demands that seemed designed less to address legitimate issues than to establish Linda's authority over every aspect of his daily life. But the harassment had taken a darker turn when Linda discovered that David's house was officially classified as owner-occupied rather than rental property. Instead of acknowledging her mistake, she had doubled down on her campaign, suggesting in HOA meetings that David's suspicious work schedule and lack of integration into community life made him an unsuitable neighbor, regardless of his homeowner status. The implications were unmistakable to anyone who understood coded language about who belonged in suburban communities and who didn't. David's training had taught him to recognize patterns, and Linda's behavior followed the classic arc of escalating persecution. Small complaints designed to test his response, increasingly unreasonable demands meant to provoke confrontation, social isolation tactics aimed at turning other residents against him. What made the situation particularly frustrating was that David's actual job, infiltrating criminal organizations and building cases against some of the most dangerous criminals in the region, required him to maintain a low profile and avoid any conflicts that might compromise his cover identity. He couldn't reveal his federal law enforcement status without potentially endangering ongoing investigations. So he had endured Linda's harassment with the patience of someone who understood that bigger battles sometimes required tactical retreats in smaller ones. But Linda's campaign had grown bolder as David's restraint was interpreted as weakness. She had organized neighborhood meetings to discuss property value concerns that somehow always focused on David's house. She had circulated petitions demanding increased HOA enforcement that contained language specifically targeting his lifestyle patterns. She had even contacted local police to file suspicious activity reports about his irregular schedule and unknown visitors, federal colleagues, who occasionally stopped by for case consultations. The morning's confrontation had been triggered by David's need to attend an emergency briefing about a major organized crime investigation. He had parked his unmarked federal vehicle in front of his own house at 6:30 a.m., planning to review case files before the meeting. Linda had emerged from her house like a suburban Terminator, marching directly to David's car with the righteous fury of someone who had decided that this was the morning for a final confrontation. "This vehicle has been parked in front of my house for 3 days," she had announced, which was categorically false. David had returned from a weekend surveillance operation just the night before. "It's ugly, it's disruptive, and it's not going to be tolerated anymore." David had tried to explain that the car was legally parked on a public street in front of his own property, but Linda had been beyond reason. She had grabbed the door handle and yanked it with enough force to bend the frame, then slammed it with the kind of violence usually reserved for domestic disputes. The damage was immediate and extensive. Beyond the obvious physical destruction, Linda had potentially compromised sensitive federal equipment and created a security risk that would require extensive investigation. But what she still didn't understand was that she had just escalated a neighborhood dispute into a federal crime scene. And David Carter, who had spent 15 years building cases against criminals who thought they were above the law, was about to demonstrate the difference between HOA authority and federal jurisdiction. The briefcase in his hand contained not just case files, but his federal credentials, encrypted communication devices, and direct contact information for supervisors who took assaults on federal agents very seriously, regardless of whether those assaults occurred in back alleys or suburban driveways. Linda Hartwell was about to discover that some battles had consequences far beyond HOA violation notices. David's phone buzzed with an encrypted message just as Linda disappeared into her house, apparently satisfied with her morning's destruction. The text was from his supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Patricia Morrison. "Emergency briefing moved to your location. Federal response team en route. Maintain operational security." The irony was overwhelming. Linda's assault on this vehicle had triggered exactly the kind of federal law enforcement response that she had been unknowingly inviting with 18 months of harassment targeting a federal agent. But the real twist was yet to come. Within minutes, 3 black SUVs appeared at the end of Willowbrook Heights' pristine cul-de-sac, their arrival as subtle as an earthquake in the perfectly manicured suburban landscape. Federal agents emerged with the purposeful movements of professionals responding to an assault on one of their own, their presence transforming David's quiet neighborhood into an active crime scene. Special Agent Morrison approached David's damaged vehicle, her expression grim as she assessed the destruction. "Agent Carter, are you injured?" "No, ma'am, but federal property has been destroyed and sensitive equipment may be compromised." "Understood. We're treating this as an assault on a federal officer and destruction of government property." She gestured toward the technical team that was already examining David's vehicle. "What can you tell me about the subject?" David provided a brief overview of Linda's harassment campaign, but what he said next shocked even his experienced supervisor. "Ma'am, I've been monitoring the subject's activities as part of my cover maintenance, and I've discovered some concerning patterns that may be relevant to our ongoing investigations." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "Explain." Linda Hartwell, the HOA president, has been systematically targeting multiple residents for what appears to be discriminatory enforcement. But more importantly, she's been documenting residents' work schedules, travel patterns, and visitor information in ways that go far beyond normal HOA activities. David pulled out his phone and showed Morrison photographs he had taken of Linda's violation reports, documents that contained detailed surveillance notes about residents' daily routines, license plate numbers of visitors, and timing patterns that read more like intelligence gathering than community management. She's been creating detailed profiles of every resident who doesn't fit her demographic preferences, and she's been sharing this information with external parties through what she claims are property management consultants. Morrison's expression darkened as she reviewed the documents. "Agent Carter, are you suggesting that the subject may be engaged in activities relevant to our organized crime investigations?" "Ma'am, I think Linda Hartwell has been unknowingly providing surveillance data to criminal organizations that use HOA records to identify federal agents, law enforcement personnel, and potential targets in upscale communities." The revelation hit like a bombshell. What had appeared to be simple suburban harassment was potentially part of a larger criminal intelligence network that used HOA presidents and community managers to gather information about law enforcement personnel living in suburban communities. Morrison immediately activated her secure radio. "This is Stacey Morrison. I need a full surveillance team on location and a data analysis unit to review HOA records for potential intelligence breaches." The quiet suburban morning was rapidly transforming into a federal investigation that would ultimately expose a network of criminal intelligence gathering that stretched across multiple states and dozens of suburban communities. But Linda Hartwell, watching from her front window as federal agents swarmed the neighborhood, still had no idea that her obsessive documentation of David's activities had made her an unwitting participant in organized crime surveillance operations. The knock on her door came exactly 30 minutes after she had slammed David's car door. Special Agent Morrison stood on Linda's front porch, flanked by 2 federal agents, their presence as official and intimidating as anything Linda had ever encountered. But what truly shocked Linda was seeing David Carter standing beside them, no longer the harassed neighbor she had been tormenting, but a federal agent with 15 years of experience investigating exactly the kind of criminal networks that her information gathering had unknowingly supported. "Linda Hartwell," Morrison announced formally. "I'm Special Agent Morrison with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We need to discuss your activities as HOA president and your documentation of resident information." Linda's face went through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, disbelief, and finally dawning horror, as she realized that the man she had been harassing for 18 months was actually a federal agent whose cover she had been systematically attempting to blow. "This is impossible," she whispered. He can't be." "Ma'am, Agent Carter is a 15-year veteran of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. Your harassment of him and destructive spy on a federal property this morning constitute serious federal crimes." But Morrison wasn't finished. "More importantly, we have evidence that your information-gathering activities may have compromised ongoing federal investigations and potentially endangered the lives of law enforcement personnel." The words hit Linda like a physical assault. She had spent 18 months believing she was protecting her community from an undesirable neighbor, but she had actually been attacking a federal agent and potentially assisting criminal organizations in identifying law enforcement targets. "I didn't know," she stammered. I was just trying to maintain community standards." David stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years confronting criminals far more dangerous than suburban tyrants. "Mrs. Hartwell, ignorance isn't a defense against federal crimes. You assaulted a federal officer, destroyed government property, and potentially compromised national security investigations." The morning that had begun with Linda's triumphant assault on David's car had become the beginning of the end of everything she had built in Willowbrook Heights. But the full scope of her fall from power was still to come. The transformation of Willowbrook Heights from quiet suburban community to active federal crime scene was swift and comprehensive. Within 2 hours of Linda's assault on David's vehicle, the neighborhood was crawling with federal agents, technical specialists, and investigators who were treating the pristine cul-de-sac like a counterintelligence operation. Neighbors emerged from their homes with expressions ranging from curiosity to terror, watching as their HOA president was led away in handcuffs while federal agents examined every document, computer, and communication device in her house. The woman who had ruled their community with iron-fisted authority for 3 years was now the subject of a federal investigation that would ultimately expose her as an unwitting intelligence asset for organized crime networks. But the most dramatic moment came when Special Agent Morrison assembled the entire neighborhood for a briefing that would shatter everything they thought they knew about their community and the man Linda had been systematically harassing. "Residents of Willowbrook Heights," Morrison announced from David's driveway, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing Congress about national security issues, "you need to understand what has been happening in your community for the past 18 months." She gestured toward David, who stood beside her in a formal suit that transformed him from quiet neighbor to obvious federal law enforcement. "Agent David Carter is a 15-year veteran of the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. He moved to this community to maintain operational cover while investigating criminal networks that threaten national security." The crowd's murmur of surprise was audible, but Morrison wasn't finished. "Your former HOA president, Linda Hartwell, has been systematically harassing Agent Carter and documenting his activities in ways that compromised ongoing federal investigations and potentially endangered the lives of law enforcement personnel." She held up copies of Linda's meticulous violation reports, which suddenly looked less like community management and more like intelligence gathering. These documents contain detailed surveillance information about a federal agent's daily routines, work schedule, and operational patterns. This information was shared with external parties, who we now believe were connected to the criminal organizations Agent Carter was investigating. The implications hit the gathered neighbors like a collective punch to the gut. Their HOA president hadn't been protecting property values. She had been unknowingly providing intelligence to criminals who were targeting federal agents in suburban communities. David stepped forward, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent years testifying in federal court. For 18 months, I endured Mrs. Hartwell's harassment because revealing my identity would have compromised ongoing investigations that ultimately led to the arrest of 17 members of an organized crime network. He gestured toward the damaged federal vehicle. This morning, when Mrs. Hartwell assaulted me and destroyed federal property, she crossed a line that forced us to abandon operational security and expose a criminal intelligence network that had been using HOA presidents across 3 states to gather information about law enforcement personnel. The crowd was silent, processing the revelation that their quiet neighborhood had been the center of a federal counterintelligence operation. But Morrison had one more bombshell to deliver. The external parties Mrs. Hartwell shared information with have been identified as members of the Costello crime family, the same organization that Agent Carter's task force has been investigating for 3 years. Her obsessive documentation of his activities provided these criminals with detailed intelligence about federal law enforcement operations. Linda Hartwell, who had been released on federal bond but was present for the briefing, stood at the edge of the crowd looking like she had aged a decade in a single morning. The woman who had wielded absolute authority over the community. He was now facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Mrs. Hartwell, Morrison continued, her voice carrying the weight of federal prosecution authority, your harassment of Agent Carter constitutes obstruction of justice, assault on a federal officer, destruction of government property, and potentially treason, depending on what our investigation reveals about your knowledge of the criminal connections. Linda tried to speak, but her voice emerged as a barely audible whisper. I didn't know. I just wanted him to follow the rules. David's response was measured but devastating. Mrs. Hartwell, the rules you enforced were designed to document and disrupt the activities of a federal agent. Whether you knew it or not, you were functioning as an intelligence asset for organized crime. He turned to address the gathered neighbors, many of whom had supported Linda's harassment campaign against him. For 18 months, this community allowed one person's prejudices and power hunger to create an environment where a federal agent was systematically targeted and endangered. You trusted someone who turned your HOA into a criminal intelligence operation. The silence that followed was profound. Neighbors who had attended HOA meetings where Linda presented her evidence against David now understood that they had been participants in a criminal conspiracy, however unwittingly. But the most powerful moment came when David addressed Linda directly, his words carrying the weight of 18 months of patient endurance in the face of systematic persecution. Mrs. Hartwell, you spent 18 months trying to drive me from this community because you decided I didn't belong here. You used official systems, harassment campaigns, and ultimately violence to try to destroy my life. His voice grew stronger, carrying the passion of someone who had finally found the words he had been searching for throughout months of patient suffering. But what you never understood is that I didn't move to Willowbrook Heights to hide from people like you. I moved here because I believed in the idea of a community where people could live peacefully, regardless of their background, profession, or lifestyle. He gestured toward the federal vehicles and agents that filled the street. You turned this community into a weapon against one of the people whose job is to protect it. You made neighbors into unwitting accomplices in criminal intelligence gathering, and you destroyed the trust that holds communities together. Morrison stepped forward with a final announcement that would reshape Willowbrook Heights forever. The FBI is taking over all HOA records and communications for the past 3 years as part of our organized crime investigation. This community will be subject to federal oversight until we can ensure that it's no longer being used as an intelligence gathering operation by criminal organizations. The words marked the end of Linda Hartwell's reign and the beginning of a federal investigation that would ultimately expose similar operations in dozens of communities across the country. But for David Carter, it was something simpler and more personal. The moment when justice finally caught up with someone who had believed herself beyond accountability. 8 months later, David Carter stood in the same driveway where Linda Hartwell had destroyed federal property and unwittingly exposed a criminal intelligence network that stretched across 3 states. But the scene had transformed completely from that morning of violence and revelation. The federal investigation had been swift and comprehensive. Linda faced federal charges that would likely result in a 15-year prison sentence, while the criminal network that had been using HOA records to target federal agents had been dismantled completely. 17 arrests, 8 convictions, multiple communities freed from unwitting participation in organized crime intelligence operations. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible in the daily life of Willowbrook Heights itself. The new HOA board, elected after Linda's arrest, operated under federal oversight and community transparency requirements that ensured no single person could ever again wield the kind of unchecked authority that had enabled Linda's campaign of harassment. Board meetings were public, decisions required community input, and enforcement actions needed documented justification rather than personal preference. David's neighbors, who had initially supported Linda's harassment campaign, had undergone a profound transformation in their understanding of community, justice, and the dangers of allowing prejudice to masquerade as policy. The Hendersons, who had once avoided David based on Linda's warnings, now invited him to family barbecues and had learned that federal agents were neighbors, not threats. The community garden that Linda had tried to ban as inappropriate agricultural activity now flourished as a shared space where neighbors worked together on something productive rather than destructive. David's modest herb garden had expanded into a community resource that brought people together around shared labor and shared harvest. But the most powerful change was in David himself. The 18 months of harassment had tested his faith in community and justice, but the resolution had restored his belief that truth and patience could overcome even the most systematic persecution. As federal vehicle, the one Linda had destroyed in her moment of ultimate arrogance, had been replaced with an identical model that served as a daily reminder to the community of what they had almost lost through their acceptance of one person's hatred. The technical equipment that Linda had potentially compromised had led to security improvements throughout the federal law enforcement community, ensuring that other agents working undercover in suburban communities would have better protection against similar intelligence-gathering operations. On this particular morning, as David prepared for another day protecting national security, he paused to watch his neighbors beginning their own daily routines. Children walked to school bus stops without fear. Parents left for work knowing their community was safe. Elderly residents tended gardens and chatted with neighbors who saw diversity as strength rather than threat. The mailman waved as he delivered letters to David's properly maintained mailbox, the same mailbox Linda had once cited for being the wrong color. The lawn she had obsessed over now grew at whatever length David preferred, because communities had learned that grass height mattered less than the character of the people who tended it. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow who lived 3 houses down, stopped by with homemade cookies and updates about her grandson's military service. She had become a regular fixture in David's life, someone who understood that service came in many forms and deserved respect regardless of whether it was rendered in uniform or undercover. As David loaded his briefcase with the case files that represented his ongoing commitment to protecting communities like Willowbrook Heights, he reflected on the lesson that had emerged from his ordeal. Power, whether wielded through HOA authority, criminal organizations, or federal law enforcement, was only as legitimate as the purposes for which it was used. When authority became a weapon against the innocent, it ultimately destroyed itself. But when it served justice, protected the vulnerable, and preserved the possibility of peaceful coexistence, it created something worth defending. The morning was quiet, but it was the peaceful silence of contentment rather than the suspicious stillness of fear. In his rearview mirror, David could see Willowbrook Heights settling into another day of community life built on truth rather than prejudice, cooperation rather than control. Linda Hartwell's attempt to destroy a federal agent had ultimately strengthened both the community she claimed to protect and the justice system she had unknowingly attacked. Sometimes the greatest victories came not from avoiding conflict, but from enduring it long enough for truth to emerge victorious.